Hello, ready to finish our story about Gideon? Well, God had chosen Gideon to deliver Israel, and he was to lead the soldiers to fight those Midianites. Remember, Gideon kind of rhymes with Midian. And they had been very unkind to God's special people, and God was going to intervene, and he was going to deliver the Israelites. And God promised Gideon that he would be with him. But Gideon called out for the soldiers, and I'm sure that Gideon thought it's going to take a lot of really strong, powerful soldiers to fight against these Midianites. So he called all of the men, the soldiers, to come meet him, and he would tell them about that God had chosen him to go against the Midianites. And so they all came, and he knew that they were going to need a lot of men. But God said, there are too many soldiers. This is too many. I don't want you to have that many. And Gideon was so surprised. He was sure he was going to need every single soldier to fight that huge army. But did he argue with God? No. He knew that God would be with him, and he had faith. He knew God knew best. So he obeyed God, and he told them that if any of them were afraid, they could go back to their homes, because he knew that God had chosen just the right people. And if somebody was afraid, they didn't have enough faith, they could go home. Well, many of the soldiers were glad to hear Gideon's words because they really didn't want to fight, and they were glad to go home. In fact, 20,000 men went back home. Well, after those soldiers left the camp, Gideon looked and was amazed at how few soldiers were actually left. He thought for sure that was the right amount. But guess what? God said, no, Gideon, that's still too many soldiers. So he said, I want you to go down to the water, and the ones I tell you, I want to go home, certain ones. So he said, I want you to go down, and when they get to the water, if a person reaches out to drink some water on their hands and knees to get all they wanted, if they got down on their knees to scoop up the water, to get lots of water because they were thirsty, then I want them to go home. They can go home. And some of their men did get water that way. And God said, those can go home. But if the men that bent down to get water stood on their feet, and they stayed very alert, and they didn't get on their hands and knees, they were going to be ready. And God said, those are the men that will stay with you and fight. These are the men that will set Israel free. The ones that were going to be alert and ready. And guess what? Gideon obeyed, and they sent the rest of the soldiers home. And how many do you think there were left? There were only 300 soldiers left. Usually there would be thousands of soldiers to fight against another people or another army. But there were only 300. But God told Gideon that by these 300 men, I will give you victory against the Midianites. Well, that night, while the men were sleeping, God told Gideon to take one of his servants and go spy on the Midianite camp. So he went and spied, and he saw, he was looking to see how many there were. And Gideon obeyed, and he saw that there were so many tents. In fact, there were so many tents, they couldn't even count them all. Oh my goodness, how are they going to fight all of those Midianites with only 300 men? But that night while they were sleeping, God told Gideon in the darkness to go up to one of the tents in the camp and listen to the men. And they were talking. And as Gideon was listening to the men, one of the men was telling the other one about a dream he said. And the first man said, I dreamed that while we were sleeping, a loaf of bread rolled down the hill and smashed our tent. And the second man answered and said, that can only mean one thing, that Gideon's going to come down the hill and he's going to defeat our army. Well, when Gideon heard this, he knew that God was going to help them. God had given the Midianite that dream. And the next day he was going to be ready to fight the Midianites with only his 300 men. So what he did is he divided the soldiers into 3 groups. And to each of the groups, he gave a trumpet. And he gave them a trumpet, and he also gave them a torch. So all they had was a trumpet to blow, and they had torches in their hands. And there we go. So they had trumpets and torches. Can you imagine what they were going to do? Is that enough to fight an army? Just trumpets and torches? And then he gave them an empty jar. And the empty jar would cover the torch until they were ready. And he divided the soldiers up and he said, we are going to surround the enemy camp on 3 sides with darkness. And when I and my group blow our trumpets, you must blow your trumpets and shout, the sword of the Lord and Gideon. Do you remember when they went into Jericho and they shouted after marching around the walls 7 times? So this is a little bit similar, isn't it? Well, the 3 groups of Gideon's soldiers went to the 3 sides and waited. And when Gideon gave the signal, the soldiers blew their trumpets, and then they broke the pitchers and shouted, the sword of the Lord and Gideon. And the lighted torches, which had been hidden in the pitchers, seemed to light up the whole mountainside. And the Midianites awoke up, and they were so startled. And they heard the breaking of those pitchers and the shouting. And when they saw the torches up on the hillside, they panicked. They were terrified. And guess what they did? They started fighting each other. And many soldiers were killed in their own camp. They just started fighting with each other. And Gideon and his men won the battle because God had been with them and helped them. God doesn't need great numbers of people to be successful. All he needs is one willing person like Gideon that would be brave but also obedient to what God wanted for him. Well, after that successful battle, Gideon was the judge in Israel for 40 more years. So he was one of the judges. And our story, this last 2 stories, is from the book of Judges. Remember the books of the Bible? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. We learned about the story of Joshua fighting Jericho. And then Judges. So Gideon is one of our first judges we're going to learn about. And we're going to learn about some more of the judges next time.